I'd like to invite Abby Hook with Hook Nar and Associates to provide us with an overview of the watershed planning work done to date. And this is entitled the Lower Coquitlam River Watershed Plan, Successes November 2012 to May 2014. So Abby's a hydrologist based from Seattle, Washington, and has been working with us and facilitating our varying personalities on the watershed plan. She's using the open standards for the practice of conservation, which is an alternative approach to watershed planning.
As Blair just said, thank you, Blair. We are up from Seattle. We do a lot of watershed planning at the watershed scale in the Puget Sound, and we've worked with everyone from governments to our local tribes to our nonprofit environmental groups. So this is a familiar setting for us, but still it's very exciting to be here. There has been a lot of progress made in the last 18 months, and I look forward to reviewing that with you. So I'm going to start my timer so that I don't bore you guys for too long. The purpose of today, we tried to break these presentations up. I don't want to be in front of you too much. I'd like you to be interacting with the materials that we've asked for review on, and also with each other to talk about what your vision of the watershed continues to be as we present more information for your consumption. So with that, we can get started on what we've been doing for the last 18 months. Next. Open standards. For those of you in the room who have never heard this expression, it's kind of a weird title for a planning framework. It doesn't initially mean very much when you say the open standards. And what the open standards is referring to is a transparent planning process that starts with getting diverse groups together to talk about what the common goals are. So even though we have 5 steps in the open standard process, which is the basic adaptive management, plan, do, check to see if you're on track, and adapt if you're not. There's a 5th in this graphic, which is learn from others. Even though we're in a 5-step process, we've spent the last 18 months just on the first step, because building that foundation of a common vision and common goals is so important. So again, we are now today finally on point D here, and hopefully moving forward off of step 1 in the near future. But this is where we are. We are conceptualizing. Next slide, please. So in open standards, one of the things that we do that's a little bit different is often when you get together for a planning effort, everyone says, we should do this. And we don't start there. We start with what the common goal is. So the first thing that is a little bit different is we've asked the roundtable to define the desired outcomes before we talk about actions. Everyone in here has ideas for actions, and they're good ideas for actions, but what we're trying to do is get all these diverse views to orient in the same direction when we start talking about where we're going to put our time, capacity, money, effort, influence into strategies. If groups don't want to start with actions, they often say, we don't have enough information to do anything. We don't know enough. Let's study, let's research, let's collect information, and then let's decide on our actions. And the other advantage of the open standards is it allows for actions without perfect information. So as you'll see today, we've spent the last 18 months gathering the best information we can. Some of that is quantitative, some of it is qualitative. Some of it, frankly, is gut reactions to things, but it allows for you to put placeholders in for where you know things and where you don't, but you can continue to move forward, knowing that you can come back and check to see if your assumptions were correct. You can come back and start to fill in information where you had these big voids where you simply didn't know what was going on in the watershed. And finally, again, that systematic framework. So allowing the people involved to define what it is they care about, how you measure the health of the thing that you care about, how you identify what is degrading those things in the watershed that need to be protected or conserved or restored, so that as you get better information, you can start to fill in the picture of what it is that's going on in the Coquitlam watershed. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in real words? Sometimes when we get off into planning speaks, it's hard to know what we're talking about at points. And these are the basic steps of step 1 of conceptualizing, of planning where it is we're headed. So Can you hit the space bar, sorry. Before Michelle and I entered the picture, you had spent as a roundtable and as a core committee a tremendous amount of time doing your visioning, deciding on the project area, identifying who your players were, identifying who those diverse views were at the table. And so when we came in November 2012, that had been established. And that's when we really launched what I would call the information gathering. What we asked the roundtable at a meeting in POCO in November 2012 was, if you hit the space bar, what do you care about in your watershed? What do you think is critical to say that your watershed is healthy? And how healthy do you think those things are? So those can be ecological value, habitats, and species and processes. They can be the things that humans depend on from the watershed for their well-being. So what does the watershed provide to the Coquitlam residents and the people who care about the Coquitlam watershed that makes you a happier human being? And that's what we set out to define in that first roundtable workshop. Then last June we got together and we said, okay, we've now defined what we care about and what we're looking to protect, conserve, restore. What are the human activities that could be threatening that health? And which of those pressures are the worst? Thanks. And then finally today, what we're going to ask the group who's here is, why do there continue to be problems? What is the context of Coquitlam that makes you different or the same from other watersheds, other planning efforts? What is your culture here that is supporting the current situation? So that's the last line there, spacebar. Next, yeah, thank you. Okay, next slide. So what you'll see that we've done in past roundtables that seems to work is we will go over the information that we've collected in past roundtables and how it was synthesized, and then we'll ask you for new information today. So what do we care about? This was in November 2012, and this in Open Standards is what we call components. Again, Open Standards is a little bit different in that it allows you to identify both ecological components, so the habitat, species, ecological processes that are important to the watershed, as well as the human well-being component. So what is it in your community that's important to you that depends on a healthy environment? We got a lot of feedback in that November 2012 meeting, and the task group spent several months looking across the hundreds of suggestions to try to form what you're seeing now as the components. So for the ecological components, we have the river system and tributaries, all species of salmon in the watershed, riparian zones, so the forests and areas most proximate to the river, and natural areas. And for human well-being, we have livable communities, resource industries, and again, thinking about the tie-in of these human well-being components to what parts of the environment they depend on, cultural and spiritual values, so the aesthetics or the religious feeling that you can get from nature, human health and safety, the stewardship ethic, and the ability to recreate in this watershed. The purple eyes indicate that, well, they're indicators. They indicate that we have measures that show how healthy. We're starting to gather information on how you describe the health of those components. I also want to point out that there are trade-offs. When you plan, it's often easy to plan in a vacuum and not account for what your planning does to other things throughout the watershed. In this case, we know that recreation in the form of fishing has an effect on salmon. We know that cultural and spiritual values may be dependent on more than just riparian zones. So there is a relationship even within our components that we need to account for as we move forward. There likely are going to be trade-offs between the things the residents in a watershed care about. That sounds very simple when I say it out loud, but from a planning perspective, it can get rather complex. Next. So what is the condition of our components? Again, we are calling this our health assessment. How healthy are the things that you have identified that are critical in your watershed in order to have a healthy lower Coquitlam River watershed? This is a little bit difficult to read, so I'll just read through it. This is an example that we presented in the June 2013 roundtable on how we're assessing the health. So in this case, we have the component, which is riparian zones. And we've said on the far left that riparian zones have 3 categories that have to be healthy in order to say that they're in good condition. Their size, their condition, and their context, so how they're reacting to things around them. You can see, and I'm not going to go into chapter and verse here, but you can see that for the first indicator, which is % of riparian forest that has a certain width, we know a lot, and we can say that 64% of the riparian forests in the Coquitlam watershed have a good buffer condition, a good buffer size. But we don't know what the maturity of that riparian area is, so that is data deficient. Again, we're putting placeholders in for where we know we want measures that will tell us more about the health of the things that we care about in the watershed, but we're still moving forward understanding that action is important now to protect and restore these things. So this is the case with almost all of the components. No component has perfect information, but we worked with the experts for about 6 months to figure out what data was available, and it is now recorded in a system that likely will be improved over time. Next. So going back to this, just stepping through the open standards is a very formulaic planning process that asks you for this identification up front. In the June 2013 roundtable, the next thing that we did after presenting the health of the components was to say, okay, what is it that's putting pressure on these components? What human activities is affecting the things that you look to protect, conserve, or restore? So we'll go over those next. In the next slide. Again, we asked the roundtable participants for written notes, and we got, Michelle, I'll look to you, over 100 easily recommendations for what the human activities were that were present in the Coquitlam and actively affecting the components. And we boiled them down to the best of our ability to be here. So you can look through those quickly. Again, we had a couple that surprised me. I've been doing this a while, and the Coquitlam watershed residents strongly said that mainstream cultural norms, or apathy, is a problem in the Coquitlam watershed. That was a little bit different than things we've seen in the past. That's a little more difficult to describe, more difficult to actually define than something like blocking culverts or invasive species. So you're forging new ground here, and I think I just want to recognize that's important, and it's getting to the root cause of what you think is causing environmental degradation here. You'll also see that there are some trade-offs even here. Mining is identified as a pressure, but resource industries are something that we'd like to support in the watershed that are part of those components. So figuring out what the problems are associated with something like water extraction, understanding that water supply is critical for human health. Again, the trade-offs, recognizing those hard conversations that likely are going to happen moving forward in a collaborative process. Okay, and then we'll move forward. So the next thing that we did with the task group, and I know this is difficult to read, it's too much information to digest in a PowerPoint, so I'll just describe to you generally what it is, and of course Margaret and Marnie have all this information as a backup. We asked the roundtable participants not only what pressures were in the watershed, so what are the human activities that are causing some problems, but exactly what components are they affecting? So what you see on the left side on moving down are the different pressures, and across the top are the different components. So every time there's a colored cell, it indicates that the task group said there was a relationship, or that the roundtable people had specified that in this case, hazardous spill had an effect on salmon. Makes sense. But what we wanted to know is a little bit more than that. So if there are a number of things affecting salmon in the watershed, which are the most pressing? And how we did that was with the task group, we did a scope, severity, and irreversibility. So we asked the watershed to think about each pressure and to think about how widely the pressure was applied across the watershed, how much it was impacting the component, and finally, how much effort would it take to reverse the effect that it was currently having on that component. This was not necessarily a data-driven exercise. To do the GIS or collect the data to do watershed-wide pressures assessment would have been, well, it probably would have been impossible because those data simply don't exist. But we worked with experts and again with the task group to get the best possible read on what was going on in the pressures. And I want to be very clear about this. This was a very uncomfortable exercise. The task group had some hard conversations, and what you're seeing in this chart is something that everyone could live with, but likely that no person in the task group thought was perfect. And it was difficult, and I commend the task group for working forward. This is not carved in stone, but it's the first snapshot on the opinions of the experts in the watershed. So please keep that in mind, because we don't have anything, again, that has perfect data. We're trying to get the best bead on what's going on out there. So moving forward next. So what did this look like? An example of a rating. And I'm going to be referring to my notes, so patience a little bit. Stormwater on salmon. So for the scope, that was high. That meant that it was happening widespread throughout the watershed. 30 to 70% of the watershed, lower watershed, is affected by stormwater. The salmon runs would be affected by stormwater. Severity, a medium, would be that within the project scope, the pressure is likely to moderately degrade or reduce the component or the population by 11 to 30% within 10 years or 3 generations. So the reason I'm reading these, it's a little pedantic, but they are very specific categories that the task group was asked to choose collaboratively. And this took, for 8 pressures, this took 2.5 days. So long conversations where we brought experts on stormwater, experts on, from the city on vandalism in to try to get the best understanding of how they saw the watershed condition. Vandalism on riparian areas, again, this should be no surprise. A lot of tree cutting, partying, dumping goes on in the riparian areas. Generally, scope high, severity high, it's really affecting that component. But the irreversibility, with some effort, could be reversed with a medium effort. So not easy, not within 2 to 5 years, but perhaps within 6 to 10. Okay, moving on. And so what does this tell us? And again, I urge you to not think about this set in stone, but if you start thinking about the health of your habitats and your species and your human well-being, and then you start thinking about the severity of your pressures, where those pressures are being applied and on what, it might tell you what issues you want to deal with first. So this might get to how you start to organize the sequencing of your strategies. So in this case, I showed you this before, one of the measures for riparian health was riparian areas that had invasive species. The experts put the riparian areas into a fair condition, which is defined by some invasive patches between 5 and 15% of the riparian zones. Invasive species as a pressure rated high. So widespread, getting worse, affecting a lot of the riparian zones. And the irreversibility, it's medium, when I would argue that it's medium if you get on it now. It probably gets a little bit higher if you let these patches grow. But the overall rating for the invasive species pressure was high. So what this tells me, looking at this, is if you've got a high pressure, it may be shoving your riparian areas from a fair condition into a poor condition. That health assessment might actively be changing in the next couple years. And because that health is threatened, it may be a place where you'd like to put some of your strategy capital. So that might bring this to the top of the list in terms of what needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later. Again, this is a storytelling exercise. There is nothing statistical. We're not running any graphs. We're not running any matrices. This is simply trying to get the best information to tell the story on where you might want to start. Okay, well with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave Dunkley, who is going to be introducing our keynote speakers for the day. Thank you for your patience. I want to make sure that we get the background before we start to move into the exercise today.